Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for the kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you all. And I thank you for attending. I believe Anne reached out to me to do this presentation back when Julian Assange was still being prosecuted. And in fact, I went back and looked. It was about a day or so before that I said I would speak. And then we had this incredible news that Julian Assange would be freed from Belmarsh prison in London and would be released. Then he'd plead guilty and would get to finally rejoin his family in Australia, where he is now. Just a little bit more about me, and then I'll get into the issues, the critical issues that are at stake and at play in this case. And even though it's over, it's still one that people should be familiar about. I've done this work for almost 15 years now, doing this kind of journalism. I have a newsletter, The Dissenter, which is at thedissenter.org, that covers press freedom, whistleblowing, and government secrecy. I wrote a book about this case called Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange, that was a chronicle of and a collection of a lot of reporting that I have had the privilege and opportunity to do on these cases. And before Julian Assange, the government would bring cases under the Espionage Act, and they'd go after whistleblowers, or they'd go after people who had leaked information to the press. Most of the time, that information was in the public interest, and it involved things that the government was hiding from us. But in Julian Assange's case, he's the first publisher or journalist to be charged under the Espionage Act. And that's why it attracted so much attention, so much worldwide condemnation over the last 5 years, and why ultimately I think Julian Assange and the global movement, of which Anne was a part, and I'm sure some of you were a part, we ultimately succeeded in triumphing and getting Julian out of prison so that this wasn't as dangerous of a president as it could have been. I mean, I'll get to what this means for the future, but by and large, everyone has to be pleased that there isn't going to be a trial for Julian Assange in Alexandria, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., where the government agencies can bring people day in and day out during a trial and attack Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for performing journalism that contributed to our global knowledge about so many important issues about U.S. wars, about U.S. diplomacy, and also shedding light on human rights abuses. Uh, so many issues that are relevant more than ever as we look at what is unfolding in crises around the globe. So, as I say, the world needs WikiLeaks style journalism more than ever, and that's why we're talking about Julian Assange. That's why even after Julian Assange is freed, we should teach people about who he was and what was done, and how WikiLeaks founded an organization that was committed to the idea of scientific journalism, which was that if you published those materials on a website and give people access to the information, that forms the basis of news reporting rather than just giving them an article, and we're supposed to just take a reporter's word for it, or that media organization's word for it. That it would help us hold governments accountable, that it would help human rights activism, that it would help all kinds of people of conscience confront what the government does in our name. And so WikiLeaks became this archive of material, and it wasn't supposed to just be confronting the United States by chance. a soldier by the last name of Manning, who was a U.S. Army all-source intelligence analyst in Baghdad, released around 750,000 documents to the website after being snubbed, after being ignored or overlooked by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico. And Manning ultimately chose to just submit the material to WikiLeaks through their electronic submission system. It was a fairly revolutionary idea at the moment, but now, today, as I speak, there are over 70 organizations around the world, perhaps more at this point, that use a similar system so that they can accept documents and publish these files from whistleblowers or media sources that want to reveal what the government is doing. And so, the significance of going after Julian Assange under the Espionage Act and why it was alarming. Julian Assange was not a US citizen, and yet we saw the US government insisting, oh, first, Julian Assange was indicted under President Donald Trump, but President Joe Biden continued, or his Justice Department continued this prosecution. The supposedly principled and better liberal Attorney General Merrick Garland did not end the case, continued it as it was inherited from Bill Barr, who was the previous Attorney General. And it was Attorney General Jeff Sessions who had Julian Assange indicted in April of 2019. And so this was an extraterritorial application of a US law to an Australian citizen who was in the Ecuador embassy and had claimed political asylum because he feared persecution from the US government, and also did not want to leave to answer for any other criminal cases that might have been brought against him because he didn't trust those governments not to pass him along to the United States government. And the way in which his legal team advised him proved to be astute and reasonable in the end, because Mike Pompeo, in particular, as the CIA director and then later as the Secretary of State, was involved in a pressure campaign with Ecuador's government to force him out of the Ecuador's embassy in London. And then he was jailed at this high security prison in Belmarsh that had a reputation, and still has a reputation, I believe, as Britain's Guantanamo. And he never signed a non-disclosure agreement. A lot of people who work for the government sign agreements. Whether they should keep those agreements or not is worth debating, but they agreed to protect classified information and not reveal it and compromise the so-called national security of the United States. Journalists like myself and others around the world, if we receive classified documents that are in the public interest, there is no oath that we've taken to any government agency to protect that material or return it to the Pentagon or give it back to the State Department or CIA. We are allowed to share it because that is part of freedom of the press. And so Julian Assange was doing what all journalists do, and yet he found himself charged under the Espionage Act simply because the material was embarrassing and it was shameful to the government, as everyone learned extensively what was going on. There was torture in Iraq and Afghanistan, the kinds of assassination or kill teams that were being deployed in Afghanistan, civilian deaths that were unaccounted for. The diplomatic cables showed that there were efforts by the Obama administration and Bush to sabotage any efforts by European countries to hold the US accountable for torture. And so they retaliated against Julian Assange very vividly. And we also saw that Mike Pompeo, and a private security company called UC Global was brought in, and its director, David Morales, was, we believe, contracted, and they worked as a kind of cutout to basically pursue an espionage operation or a spying operation against Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuador embassy. So there was a campaign, a targeted surveillance campaign waged against a foreign country or Ecuador's diplomats, and it happened while Julian Assange was inside. They were collecting audio and video recordings and doing everything they could to ensure that he wasn't able to leave London and claim diplomatic status, go to Ecuador, and be free from a future U.S. case, but then also to force him out, to ultimately convince Ecuador to abandon Julian Assange and give him up so that we could have this case. The impact on our civil liberties as a result of this case, it's probably too early to, state exactly what could happen as far as how this might be used as a precedent. The precedent of this case is the prosecution. I'm not somebody who believes that pleading guilty to these charges means that the U.S. government was given a victory and that it's wrong for Julian Assange to have accepted a deal. The reporting we had from one newspaper, Washington Post, indicates that the case was collapsing at the Justice Department, and they thought that they were going to lose their appeal in London. And so they caved and decided to start negotiating so that Julian Assange could walk free. And no longer were they fighting the global movement for Julian Assange's freedom. So, um, as we think about this precedent, it's not one that can be brought into a courtroom and used by Justice Department prosecutors to go after other U.S. journalists and citizens. However, we do have to be upset and bothered by the fact that Julian Assange was ever indicted, that this indictment was passed under Donald Trump, that Joe Biden and the Justice Department, and then I'd also add in the spokespeople at the State Department, who were some of the more outspoken defenders of this case, that they in fact believed it was justified. The White House press secretary, both of them would apologize and justify it, or say that there wasn't any questions that they needed to answer about it because it was an ongoing investigation, failing to take seriously what was going on because they were pursuing a journalist and keeping him in jail. So then, this outcome and what it means for journalists, but also what it means for citizens in general, is that we have to recognize the way in which freedom of expression generally has now been undercut. And this example will forever live on as one that says to people, this is what could happen to you, especially if you are living outside of the United States. I think especially if you are an international correspondent who isn't an American, you have to fear that the US government at any time could pursue this type of a case to limit those journalists' ability to reveal the truth about the US government. But it's a creep. It's a progression that develops. The war on whistleblowers under President Barack Obama, which I'm happy to talk more about later after we get to questions if anybody's interested, is one that develops and had always been a war on journalism, because the whistleblowers who were being prosecuted were media sources. So it impacted the ability of reporters at media organizations to do crucial work. And, you know, beyond that, um, we all have a right to this truth. We all have a right to this information. And if you look at global events right now and you consider what is happening, this is the deterrent to prevent whistleblowers from coming forward. This is the deterrent to make media organizations afraid of publishing certain materials that could help stop wars. We see what's happening with Israel's genocidal violence in Gaza. There's definitely documents that could be released there, that would confirm the truth and perhaps help bring about peace. And there's the war in Ukraine that is escalating further in recent days, and certainly documents in the possession of government officials could reveal truths that could stop that war potentially, um, and I mean help bring about a diplomatic resolution from both sides. So the war on journalism is a war on whistleblowers. It's a war on accountability and justice, and it's a war on the ability of citizens to access the truth of what our governments do in our name. And I believe that that's something we all take seriously. So that's why even with Julian Assange being freed from jail, we still should talk about his case, what we learned from it, and how we continue to fight to protect and preserve not just journalists and their ability to do their work, but all of us outside, anybody who's a citizen has a First Amendment right to engage in freedom of the press, which means you can engage in journalism. And if you were to come across something sensitive that the government didn't want to be published, you should still be able to share it with people and alert them to what is happening without fearing that you would go to jail. And so that is really what's at the core of all of this, that uh, there's an overreach. We have to fight it, and we have to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. Yes, hello. Yeah. All right. So the question is, what kind of conditions were set on Julian Assange and for his release, as part of the plea deal? This was an extremely favorable plea deal for Julian Assange, aside from the fact that, he did have to plead guilty to journalism, which is remarkable. But within the terms of the deal, as written out, uh, the lawyers were able to obtain a commitment in writing, it's in writing, that nothing that Julian Assange did with WikiLeaks before this plea deal can be the subject of prosecution. And so it was kind of a bit of of immunity, or what it says is that there's no uncharged conduct that the U.S. government can come up with to try and extradite him from Australia. There's no gag order. He can talk about it. There's nothing that says he can't return to working with WikiLeaks. He could come back and be its editor in chief. We just should recognize that the ordeal that he's been through, the trauma, the deterioration that his health and what he experienced, that he's rejoined his family. He's spending the time with his family, but we should know that that's his choice, and he's not doing it because of some threat from the U.S. government. He's not, I guess you could say, hiding. I don't believe he's hiding, but if you wanted to say he's not choosing to avoid speaking to the public because the government told him to be silent, but he's doing it because of the time that was robbed from him by the government in the last 5 years and longer, because he was stuck in the Ecuador embassy trying to convince the U.S. to say that it would not prosecute him, which of course they proceeded to do. Yeah, so if I understand the correction, the question is about war propaganda and how Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were able to cut through it. I think that that is a really important statement to make about why the US government was afraid of WikiLeaks. There's nothing more powerful than having what you would call primary source materials. So there are a lot of stories that get printed about US national security operations or US wars. There's a lot of conversation about what intelligence officials are doing, or what uh, national security people are trying to accomplish. And it's often like officials say, or an unnamed official told this to somebody, and you're not really sure where it's coming from. It's hard to verify. But if you have a document and you can point to it and illustrate what you're saying, it's proof. And that's what the US government didn't like about WikiLeaks style journalism and the kind of revolution that Julian Assange was bringing about in the news media, and also the way in which Julian Assange was independent, would operate independent from war propaganda. So many of these institutions that are in New York and Washington, D.C., who do their work there in those locations, they'll hop on the phone with people at the NSA or the CIA or the military, and they're willing to work with those officials. They'll listen and hear why certain things shouldn't be published, and oftentimes they'll protect certain things so that um, because they want to be on the side. They think that they're a part of furthering U.S. foreign policy, so they don't always challenge it as boldly as they should. And WikiLeaks was never interested in helping US foreign policy succeed, so they were always open to any documents that questioned these policies. So, for example, while the New York Times and the Washington Post might consider the way that interrogation techniques were being applied by the CIA and spin it in a way favorable to the CIA, which meant that they were whitewashing torture. That's nothing that the WikiLeaks would ever do because it simply was not out to help the United States succeed in the war on terrorism and didn't agree with the agenda that the US was pursuing. So this is absolutely a important point to make about what WikiLeaks was able to do to cut through propaganda. Yes. Contact information more available. I've got things that I'd like to talk to you about here in Milwaukee. Um, uh, Yesterday's newspaper on the front page had talked about that had been put on Star of David morphing into swastika. See quite a bit of pressure to suppress the gentleman put that image up on top from journalists here about factual information about what's going on, but it's another area here of government wanting to suppress a private citizen who has views on a war that is going on against Palestinian people. However, if you're aware of it, fine. If not, I'll seek other information on your contact information. All right. So the question was more of do I know about what happened in Milwaukee with a person who put up an image that uh, the government's trying to suppress, and I'm not familiar with this case. I'm sorry that my contact information isn't more readily available. Um, but I have my newsletter email address is newsletter@thedissenter.org. And anybody can contact me with tips about stories that way. And if there's anything in Milwaukee that's going on that has to do with what I cover, I'm always open to hearing from other people about those issues. And I might have an opportunity to do some writing about it. I'll just say generally, this crackdown on speech is vicious right now. Private citizens, uh, people who are engaged in public assembly, but also students on university or college campuses. And the rules have just been arbitrarily created by administrators to prevent them from speaking out. I mean, we saw such a surge in activism. Um, I don't, I'm not someone who was alive, so I can't really color this comparison with my own experiences, but it would seem that it was on the same level of intensity as many of the protests on campuses against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 1970s, that you had all these students that were camped out and demonstration after demonstration in places throughout the country, really around bigger cities. But this was something that was cleared very intensely. And I don't separate what was happening there with those students from what happened with Julian Assange, because I just think that it is part of a larger effort to control freedom of expression. So the question is, what is the future of WikiLeaks and other news organizations? The future of WikiLeaks is one that it's up in the air. It has an editor-in-chief. Christian Harafson was the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks while the US government was prosecuting Julian Assange. It could not really do the work that was done prior to the prosecution because of the fact that the US government was prosecuting its former editor-in-chief. It's the co-founder of WikiLeaks. And so they had to focus their attention on fighting for his freedom. But now, if they can convince the world that it is safe again to submit documents, if they're able to redevelop their site, if they're able to position themselves as a resource once more for doing this important work, then it is possible for WikiLeaks to continue going forward. Whether it involves Julian Assange or not, I think I already said that's an open question. That's basically going to depend on his health and what he would like to do after all that he's been through. And as for the other media organizations, it's kind of complex. I mean, you have corporate and establishment media outlets that might be positioned in a way that they don't have to be so afraid about the outcome, and how Julian Assange was basically forced to plead guilty to this charge in order to end the case. Um, they have lawyers. They have a law department. There's someone called a general counsel who can get on the phone and talk to the Justice Department and convince them to stop their harassment or intimidation, other means of lawfare that they use. But someone like myself, who's an independent journalist, people who are grassroots journalists, or if you wanted to call them social justice driven journalists, citizen journalists, people who have limited resources, perhaps work a couple jobs, but also have a dedication to covering certain stories or issues in their communities. If they would do something that ran afoul of the government and it was considered to compromise national security or get in the way of the US military industrial complex, then it would be difficult to discourage and find somebody who would convince the Justice Department to back down. I certainly don't have the money to hire an attorney who can protect me from a case being moved forward. And I doubt that anybody in the room today who is listening to this presentation has anybody who has the resources and funds to bring somebody on board who can convince the Justice Department to leave them alone. And so that is the issue, is that, like so much of our system, we have two tiers. And the two tiers over the last 15 years I've seen illustrated greatly. The two-tiered justice system. It's not one that's limited to just what goes on with people who are accused of petty crimes, and then it's like white collar criminals get to escape and not face prison. In the national security or military space, the lower level people who blow the whistle or leak to the press, they go to prison. The high ranking officials who do this and promote propaganda, but while compromising national security secrets, they are able to bargain with the Justice Department and avoid prosecution. The corporate journalists are able to convince the Justice Department to do the right thing and not prosecute someone for engaging in journalism, whereas somebody like myself and the average citizen, they don't have that kind of power.
Great job. I'm just real curious about his mental, emotional, physical health. Thanks.
Yeah, so the question is, what is Julian Assange's mental or physical health at this time? Now, it's been a couple months since Julian Assange was released. It's getting close to a couple months. And actually it's 3 months nearly. And so he's had a chance to see doctors outside of the Belmarsh High Security Prison. He's have opportunities to no longer be in conditions of solitary confinement that he was subjected to. And so he's on a path to recovery. And what remains to be seen is what were the long-term impacts. And I think there are very real long-term impacts. Those were already seen when he was in Belmarsh, but those long-term impacts were the result of not having sunlight when he spent 7 years. He spent 7+ years in the Ecuador embassy in London, and that was bad for his health. And so it only got worse being in prison for 5 years while he was fighting this prosecution. Um, so I think that his mental health is one in which it will always be a challenge for him to return to the kind of person that he was back in 2010. So if you go back and watch videos where he eloquently was speaking, and where he was able to be an editor of a media organization, I don't doubt that there's probably difficulties in trying to do that work today. And that's what the US government did to him. They inflicted the suffering on him that will make it hard for him to return as an editor in chief of WikiLeaks. That being said, he's still alive. So as long as he's alive and he wants to do anything, he can, and I think more important, he can be a dad to his two children that he had with his wife Stella while he was in Ecuador's London embassy. And that's really important to him right now. And so I had observed Julian Assange in covering extradition proceedings. There were a couple of times that I got to see him on the video feed when he would follow a court hearing, or when he was present during those proceedings. He did not look well. He had a mini stroke while he was going through this. He also has osteoporosis, and when he got a cold, he was coughing and broke one of his ribs. He's a frail person, but with the access to healthcare in Australia now, there might be some things that can be done for him. He's certainly much better off now than he was in the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Um, it's understandable that the government would not want information released that was embarrassing about what they were doing, torture and things like that. But can you say something about what we heard, that agents were exposed, their lives were endangered, and so on? And also, what type of self-censorship does WikiLeaks have to prevent things if there were agents that were exposed?
All right, so the question is about WikiLeaks and the exposure of agents' names. Also, I'll just go ahead and address the allegation about informants being compromised. The government accused Julian Assange and WikiLeaks of endangering confidential human sources that the military worked with, and others that the State Department worked with, who were named in the cables. And so I would just backtrack and say that first, the responsibility for secrecy lies with the US government, and in protecting those individuals, first and foremost, and they've never fully taken responsibility for, the fact that they named those individuals who were vulnerable and put them in cables, and then after they lost control of that information, now they had to respond, and they had several months to respond to protect some of these people who they claimed were endangered, and yet they didn't go into panic mode until there was this kerfuffle that happened between The Guardian and WikiLeaks. And in particular, it was set off by a Guardian news editor who published a book where he used the password for a file in as a chapter title. So then there were people who were out there in the world who were able to basically find all of the uncensored cables, the cables that had not been handled properly by WikiLeaks. They were filled with the names of people, and they were able to start sharing those all over what they call, we'll call it the dark web, although I'm not here to, do a scary local news report about your identity being stolen. So this was something that was brought up by Julian Assange's legal defense, that they were concerned about the names of people in the cables in these documents. Julian Assange contacted the State Department and warned them that something terrible could happen to these individuals. Now there was investigation by the Associated Press, which is a news wire, and they had a couple journalists that went through the documents, and they contacted people who were named and tried to ask them if they felt that they were endangered, or tried to identify any harm that was brought to them. And what they confirmed was that there really was no blood on WikiLeaks' hands when it came to it. And Robert Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense, the chief of the Pentagon, had said that he thought the panic about what could happen to anybody, informants, those working, the risk to diplomatic relationships, that was all overwrought, that basically these countries were going to continue to do work with the United States because the US is such a powerful country in the world, and countries want to be partners of the US because it is such a, as he put it, an indispensable nation. And so there's never been any confirmation that anybody was harmed or killed as a result of a WikiLeaks cable. There are people who chose to flee, but WikiLeaks is not responsible for the wars that were happening, or any destabilization of countries. In fact, I would say that the U.S. is probably responsible for that more than anything if we get down to specific examples. And so, in many cases, I would say people being alerted that they were named in these documents might have helped them get to safety. If it's kept secret and they don't know that they're in these documents, but somebody else has access to these documents and they end up being attacked, what good does that do for them? Because now they were not able to take any steps to protect their safety. So this will be a subject of debate forever and ever. But by and large, the facts show that WikiLeaks never harmed anybody, and that was just something that was said by the U.S. government to discredit WikiLeaks' journalism. Yeah, so the question is just, if I could flesh out a few more details about the way that WikiLeaks worked with the information to make sure that when they were publishing the materials on their site, they weren't compromising individuals' identities who could be endangered. And it's true that there were journalists that they partnered with, there were media organizations that were their partners. For each set of documents, they were taking some time. Sometimes they were taking such a long time that the Guardian was upset. Apparently, the Guardian wanted to move and put out their stories on the documents about the Afghanistan war, uh, or the documents about the Iraq war. And in those cases, they were a little irritated that such a long time was being taken. The databases were being built with the information. There was a lot of investigation going on, but they wanted to get their news published and get the headlines splashed all over so that they could move on to their next projects. So that impatience was different. With WikiLeaks, they were really focused and working on this material, and they did take great care with these documents. And when they partnered with people like, for example, Italian journalist Stefania Marizzi, there was there were people brought on who were familiar with the issues that were happening in a particular country, so that way they would know what could happen, what kind of fallout could happen as a result of publishing those stories. So yeah, the knee-jerk reaction, the quick effort to discredit WikiLeaks by the government has always been to say that civilian lives were endangered. People who were partners of the US government were endangered without ever putting any proof up. It's always been just figurative, possible potential harm. And clearly because they understand that that's a clever way to get people to not talk about the content of what is revealed, but to attack the ethics of a journalist, to get into discussions about whether it was right for WikiLeaks to publish the material or not. And if we're talking about that, then we're not talking about war crimes or US torture.
Try to make this succinct. Um, the somewhat comparable position what Julian Assange has gone through as far as being accused of hiding or not being being allowed to speak. My father was in Tokyo with the U.S. Embassy when Pearl Harbor was bombed. He was taken prisoner of war. It was very bad. When he was finally exchanged, he weighed 98 pounds. My mother kidnapped him and took him up to the hills in North Carolina and wouldn't let the State Department come near him. They wanted to debrief him. He had several breakdowns during that time, weeping and things like that. But he survived it. Number of the other people who were with him, he was in his 20s, who were 30 or over, committed suicide, had mental breakdowns because they did not have this initial protection. Once he had that protection, after a while, he had privacy, he was given all the space he needed, and then he was able to go back. As I say, he was in his 20s, he was able to go back and face World War II. So it is not exactly comparable, but it is somewhat like what Julian Assange has faced. Thank you.
It was kind of a question, but the speaker shared a personal story, and I thank them for sharing the story about their father and what happened to them, and how they were a prisoner. And it's a little bit difficult for me to completely recap, but I thank you for the story. There's not a lot to add, but certainly the experience of this person's father as it compares to Julian Assange is one in which, yeah, certainly I think that if you examine what Julian Assange went through, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture met with Julian Assange after he was arrested, after he was expelled from the embassy, met with him in Belmarsh, found through examination that he exhibited signs of experiencing psychological torture, that being in that embassy for so long had taken that kind of toll on him, but also just, for so long not knowing what was going to happen with him, that he didn't know when he would be free, that there was a lot of torment that had built up. And so, yes, I think there are similarities because prisoners of war, they don't know when the war is going to end. And that's true for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. For so much of this time, they didn't know when all of this was going to end.
But I was curious if you have any thoughts about it came out during kind of the Mueller investigation period that Assange appeared to be colluding with Roger Stone to dump documents to influence the election in the United States against Hillary Clinton, I believe it related to the information that got hacked from the DNC by the Russians. And to me, I mean, it looked pretty bad. I mean, you can see the reports about it. Stone, I believe, timing the document releases by WikiLeaks in October before the election and so on. And I'm just two questions. One is, do you know anything about that? Because it kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth about Assange. And then second, does that relate at all to sort of the important journalistic rights that are important in the United States elections?
All right. So the question is about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Roger Stone. And what was WikiLeaks doing? Were they colluding with Russians to interfere in the 2016 election? And does that relate to the prosecution? And then also this person, the question was, that this, would leave a bad taste in your mouth because this doesn't look good for WikiLeaks to be doing this kind of activity. So I wrote in my book, I wrote a whole thing about Russiagate and WikiLeaks and just challenging the way in which this had been used to demonize WikiLeaks. And what I wrote about Roger Stone was basically this, that Roger Stone had exaggerated the connection he had with Julian Assange, that at no point did Roger Stone actually put forward any proof that he had any knowledge, any special knowledge of WikiLeaks publications. He was certainly not a partner. He wasn't working with WikiLeaks in the way that other journalists had. And so this was him just being the kind of provocateur that we know he has been. And in fact, Roger Stone is not somebody who I would trust to speak or share anything, especially given the fact that he was a kind of henchman for Richard Nixon, and the Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who was a great supporter of mine and an incredible whistleblower and peace activist. He would speak about how Roger Stone was part of a group of people who were sent to try and break one of his legs while he was speaking at an anti-war rally in DC. That mob of people didn't get to him. He was never severely injured the way that they were thinking of doing. But this was drawn up and conceived by a group of people who were working for Richard Nixon and his little dirty tricks campaign, some of like the different things that were going on. This wasn't Watergate, but you know, that kind of idea. Um, there's a lot that was printed based upon Senate investigations, and Robert Mueller did a full investigation. What was found is that there wasn't any evidence of this, that WikiLeaks had been explicitly collaborating with Russians to try to bring down Hillary Clinton. And that, in fact, so much of this did fall under the First Amendment as protected activity. And it would be difficult to bring a case against Julian Assange for these allegations and for these suspicions. And so, you know, a lot of this idea that WikiLeaks just supports Russia was, along with the idea that they endangered individuals who were sources of the US government, another way of trying to discredit WikiLeaks. So it was actually very effective, I would say, because going out there and saying that WikiLeaks was working as kind of like a Russian plant was whether they were furthering Kremlin narratives was another thing you might hear. Going out and saying that meant that the Democrats were no longer willing to stand up to Donald Trump when Julian Assange was indicted. And like they definitely weren't going to. They were pretty silent when the files were first published under Barack Obama, but the way that I understand politics to work is that those who are out of power, the party out of power, is always willing to challenge the opposing party much more than their own party in the White House. And so, you know, Julian Assange was indicted while Trump was president, which meant there was a possibility that the Democrats could oppose this and recognize it as a threat to freedom of the press. But they always were unwilling to speak up because of what had been printed about WikiLeaks and Russia. So they didn't do much. And then, of course, Biden was elected. So now there wasn't a whole lot they could speak up and say about Assange. And then you actually had Republicans that were speaking out more than many Democrats. That just gets into the way our politics often doesn't really address any of the meaningful issues. But thanks for the question. I don't think that there's that much there when it comes to saying that WikiLeaks was working for Russia.
Actually convicted of lying about his connection to WikiLeaks because there was no connection. And also that the pages 174 to 192 in the Mueller report were redacted until it no longer mattered. And those are the pages where Mueller explained why he could not charge either Julian Assange or WikiLeaks. They had no concrete evidence. Okay, I have one last question. In the back of your book, you explain, you list 30 things that the
Okay. I'm being put on the spot just a little bit here, but there are 30 documents that I call attention to at the end of my book that come from the WikiLeaks publications. And I'm asked, which one of these 30 do I think was the most important? So I'll answer this in two different ways. What's the most important? I mean, like, what does it mean to our survival as a human species? what do we really need to know? If I answer it with that in mind, I lean towards the material that pointed to how the US was basically colluding with China to sabotage climate talks, and to make sure that the developing countries that and other countries that are horrifically impacted by climate change, that that the US and China, which are responsible for the bulk of carbon emissions, that there wouldn't be greater action taken to reduce their pollution. So nothing done to the major oil or fossil fuel industries, put the burden entirely on these developing countries to deal with what is happening. And then also the idea that there's going to be a kind of race between nations, including Russia, for the fossil fuel reserves in the Arctic Ocean as climate change melts the Arctic ice cap. I mean, I lean towards that being probably one of the more devastating and important things that we need to know about how governments function if we would like to survive. But then damaging, like, to me, if you think just in general about the material and what in this posed the most threat to the US and its image, I think those cables that show the extent that they would go to cover up human rights abuses does the US no favors as it goes around saying it's a beacon of freedom and claims to support human rights and democracy. But if you see the examples where they are interfering in Germany or Spain, I think there's even an example in the United Kingdom related to an Iraq war inquiry. If you see how far they're willing to go to pressure prosecutors or the attorney generals of those countries to not hold US soldiers or CIA agents accountable for crimes, then you get a sense of just how the US government doesn't feel it needs to follow these laws. And as we're seeing, international law being routinely violated and it rendered meaningless by what's happening in Gaza, and as we see that, so much of our news media coverage, there are certain countries in which we're supposed to be upset when war crimes are committed, but when the US commits war crimes, those are not to be punished, and we're supposed to move forward and not look back. I think that part of the documents released, those are the most damaging to the United States. All right. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for your engagement. You all asked really important questions, and let me express my gratitude to Anne and the church for, again, inviting me to be here with you all. And I'm pleased that we were able to chat with Julian Assange being free, and that I'm not here and I didn't come here to speak about a case that is still unfolding. And I wish you all the best. Sure. So the address for the newsletter that I publish regularly on whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy is called thedissenter.org, thedissenter.org, THEDISSENTER thedissenter.org. The book that I've been talking about is called Guilty of Journalism: The Political Case Against Julian Assange. And then if there's anything happening to you locally that you think I should know about, as one of the previous questions raised, I can be reached at the email is newsletter@thedissenter.org. Newsletter@thedissenter.org. That's where you should send anything about this work. So thank you very much.